and the name of where to send a donation if you want to give something to the battlefield preservation group. And although it doesn't say it on here, I would make it down in the middle part of the check for revolutionary sites, so they know where it goes. I'll have it over to the computer if anybody wants to tear one off. And now, Karen, still chasing the elusive buddy.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is, I've done this before, and I always enjoy talking with you folks, because when I go home and I try to talk about the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution, or the American Revolution period, my friends' eyes all kind of glaze over, and they get a faraway stare, and like, when is she going to stop? But down here, at least, I have a lot of friends to talk to, and we share a lot of information. As you may have guessed, I'm not speaking about Colonel Cotton. I'm speaking about Oscar Marion. You know, they say that if you learn something new every day, it's a good day. And since I've been here, I've learned two new things. I've learned that if somebody wants to offer me a nibs, I should say yes. And if they want to ask me to go noodling, I'll say no. This is a silly question. But as a speaker, it's always good to know your audience. Is there anyone here who does not know who Francis Marion is? That's refreshing. As most of you know, the most important time period in his service to the United States, in South Carolina, was between 1780 and roughly 1785, when he kept the revolution alive and helped restore the peace to South Carolina at the conclusion of the revolution, because we easily could have had a reign of terror as they had in France. Now, I'm talking about Oscar Marion, and we had somebody talk about Oscar yesterday. Some people have, Oscar is generally identified as General Marion's body servant, and William Dubbin James, who served with Marion, said the body servant's name was Oscar. Other people have called him Buddy, and so there's this dispute: is the servant Oscar or Buddy? And the answer was given to us by Johnson in the traditions of the American Revolution, where he says the servant's name was Oscar, but Marion called him Buddy as a sort of a nickname. Now, I've done this sketch of what I think Buddy may have looked like based upon a painting by John Blake White, and that will come at the end of the talk. But for now, this is the best we can do for Buddy. Now, we all know that people have nicknames. I'm sure you have friends that have nicknames, and the nicknames become more important than the real names. I can tell you who Babe Ruth was, but I couldn't tell you his real name. So the fact that Buddy became known as Buddy rather than Oscar is not amazing. Now, what is a body servant? Well, it's a valet, a gentleman's gentleman. In the military, it would be an orderly. Have any of you seen Victoria on the PBS series? It's a great series. Anyone watch Downton Abbey? Yes. So you know, in British society, the household servants, now these are all people who work for a wage, the household servants, there's a social order amongst the servants. And probably highest up in the pecking order is the butler, and on the female side it would be the housekeeper, and everybody else goes downhill from there, except for the personal body servants of the lord of the house and the lady of the house, who sometimes, actually in the case of Victoria, her personal servants were actually members of the nobility who fought for the honor to be a personal servant. Now, although Buddy was a slave, as the personal servant of somebody of Francis Marion's notoriety and importance, he was important in the social order. Not only would he have been the most important black man on Marion's plantation, he also probably been one of the most important black men in the state, and he also probably would have been in the social order higher than some free blacks, and actually higher in the social order than some white folks who did not have property and were working as common laborers. No one was going to mess with General Marion's personal servant. So Buddy had a lot of status because of that. Now we have a lot of heartburn today about Buddy, at least some people do, because he was a slave. And slavery was it's unpopular. It's not politically correct. And it never should have been politically correct. However, we cannot impose 21st century values on 18th century people. And in the 18th century, slavery was widespread. The American Indians had slaves, white folks had slaves, free blacks had slaves. The biggest collector of slaves were black tribesmen in Africa and the Barbary pirates, as it were, in the Mediterranean area. So this is not a talk about slavery. I don't want to get into that. The most important thing to note is that Buddy and Frances Marion were very close. If it was not for the social differences between the two of them, you probably would have said they were friends. Now, I've called Buddy a hero. And why do I say that? I say that because without Buddy, Frances Marion would not have been around in April or August of 1780 to start the resistance to the British occupation of South Carolina. And so for that reason, his role is very important. I'm going to go to black because after a while, the picture becomes distracting. Buddy's story basically begins with Frances Marion's grandfather, Dr. Anthony Cords, who was one of the Huguenots who came over here, the first settlers. Dr. Cords had 7 children, 3 of whom are important in the life of Frances Marion. Dr. Cords' youngest daughter, Anne, became the mother of Mary Esther Godot, who became General Marion's wife. His son, Francis Cords, was the person after whom General Marion was named and was a financial benefactor of Frances Marion. And Esther Cords married Gabriel Marion and became General Marion's mother. Esther and Gabriel had 6 children. Frances Marion was the youngest. He was born in 1732. Now, I had some talks with Chris Swager, who's a historian, who's lectured here in the past, and we both are of the opinion that Frances Marion was probably born premature because the descriptions they give of him is being bright red like a lobster and not much bigger than that. And that sounds like a premature birth to both of us. If that's the case, then Esther had a hard pregnancy and a hard birth. And given the fact that the mortality rate in South Carolina, particularly amongst children and women in childbirth, was absolutely horrendous. Your chances of surviving were not very good. Apparently, the Cords family provided Esther with what was known as a wet nurse and some assistance to help her care for this sickly little child, and there must have been a lot of loving care because he survived to become General Marion. By 1742, Frances Marion's father was either dead or in deep financial trouble because Francis Cords put a provision in his will to take care of his sister Esther and leave her some money. That was added to in 1746. Additional property was put in trust for Esther. Now the reason they put property in trust for a woman is if she was married, and then probably this is a good reason to believe that the husband was still alive, if she were married, any property she owned became the property of the husband and subject to the debts of the husband. So what was put in trust for Esther and her children was described as a wench Willoughby, a boy June, and a boy Peter. Now, some of you can probably correct me on this, but by using the term a boy, I think they're talking about a male child under the age of 15. That's my idea of what Frances Marion might have looked like, but I'm not a good artist, so. Frances Marion wrote 2 wills. The first will was probably written between 1772 and 1776, and not later than 1780. And I say this, the will's not dated, but he mentions things that were not around until 1772. He mentions his Pond Bluff estate, which he acquired in 1772, and he mentions his nephew Gabriel, who died in 1780. So no wills between there. But what he does also mention is these these slaves. He frees his old nurse, Willoughby. Now, the term nurse at that time would mean a wet nurse. He also frees his faithful man, June. So now we have two of these slaves who were earlier put in trust, that we know went to Frances Marion. When Marion's mother died, half of her property went to each of her two youngest sons, Francis and his brother Joe. So Francis ended up with Willoughby and June. Now, to be a wet nurse, Willoughby had to have had a child about the same time Frances Marion was born. So either June or Peter or both of them were born about the same time as Frances Marion. That would be 1732. He frees June, and he also frees somebody who's described as a mustee girl, which means she was half American Indian, daughter of Phoebe, by the name of Peggy. Now, Peggy will be kind of important because he provides that Peggy will be supported until she's 15, and she will be taught to read and write. Now, this is very important because it shows that Marion was not adverse to teaching a slave how to read and write. And that opens the door that possibly Buddy may also have been able to have some degree of literacy. Peggy becomes very important because in 1845, she's interviewed by a newspaper reporter who's trying to find out information on the Marion family. And from Peggy, we learn, that June had a wife, Chloe. Chloe died in 1830 at the age of 100 or thereabouts, which meant she was born in 1730. Chloe was the cook at Marion's plantation. She had a child, Phoebe. Phoebe died 1845. She was 100 years old when she died, which means she was born in 1745. That also means that Phoebe was probably 15 years old when she had, that Chloe was 15 years old when she had Phoebe. Phoebe had a brother, well, at least one brother, and that brother was Buddy, Oscar. Well, if Phoebe was born in 1745, daughter of Chloe, born in 1730, it's unlikely that Buddy was born before that, because that'd be rather young. So Buddy was probably the younger sibling of Phoebe. So I'm saying I think he was probably born around 1746. We don't know when he died, but it was sometime after 1817. But the significance of all that is that Buddy was at least 14 years younger than Frances Marion. So many of us have had the conception that Buddy and Marion were the same age. That is incorrect. Buddy was 14 years younger. June was the same age as Frances Marion, and one can almost see June and Marion hanging out, and June's little boy child kind of tagging after them, and maybe Marion said, "Hey, Buddy, come on, let's go." And so the name stuck. All of that also explains why Buddy did not go with Frances Marion to the Indian Wars, because he would have been 13 or 14 years old, 15 at the oldest, too young to go out on the Indian campaign. June was close to Marion. By tradition, he was the head man at Pond Bluff. He sort of disappears after the American Revolution. We really don't know what happened to him. We do know that Frances Marion gave June's son, Buddy, one of the best jobs on the plantation. He made it his personal servant. He gave Buddy's sister a very good job on the plantation. She was made the cook. As Marion's body servant, Buddy would have been dressed as a gentleman. He would have been taught to be polite like a gentleman. He would have been taught the laws of etiquette. Because Buddy's master would have been judged by the way Buddy behaved. And so a person of stature, who wanted to be thought as a person of stature. All of their servants that would be interacting with the public would be well-dressed and well-behaved. So Buddy was not a field hand. He would have had a pretty good life. We know that Buddy, Chloe, Phoebe, and Peggy all outlived both General Marion and Mrs. Marion. They ended up their lives on the plantation of Francis Dwight Marion. We don't know exactly when Peggy and Buddy died. We do know when Chloe and Phoebe died. Peggy eventually became the personal maid of General Francis Marion's wife at the age of 14. That was in 1786. Buddy's family, the extended family, basically were in service to the Marion family for over 150 years, at least 7 generations. It was a long-term relationship between these folks. And given the fact that Chloe and Phoebe both lived to well over 100, and that Peggy was in her 70s when she was interviewed, there was apparently a lot of respect back and forth between the two families. Okay. Revolutionary War begins. Tradition says Francis Marion closed Pond Bluff and moved all his household servants over to Bella Isle. It was a bigger plantation. There were more people there. It was safer. Francis Marion is about 44 years old. Buddy's about 30 years old, and they go off to war. It was a common thing for an officer to take a servant with him to war. 2nd South Carolina could have had as many as 33 servants working in their ranks. And you heard earlier speaker say how really kind of small that regiment was. So 33 additional men was a significant number. And early in the war, in Marion's orderly book, there's an order that comes down that says personal servants of officers will drill with the soldiers. And when the roll is called, they will enter the line, which means that Buddy was trained as a soldier, and if fighting started, he was expected to be in the line and fight with the soldiers. Now, these men, these servants were mostly black men. They could have been a few indentured white servants in the group, but they were mostly black slaves. Anybody serving with the Army in any capacity would be under military discipline and subject to military discipline. The Continental Army was not segregated. In the North, blacks joined the Continental troops quite freely. In fact, there was no particular record kept of a person's race when they joined. We know that from other sources, or secondary, not secondary sources, but contemporary sources, about 20% of the Continental Army was actually black. The percentages of black in the Navy were larger. Rhode Island had an entire regiment of blacks. They were made up of free blacks and of slaves that had been bought specifically by the state to fill out the Continental Regiment, and they were promised their freedom if they behaved well and served out their enlistments with honor. And there was no problem with them. John Lawrence wanted to enlist slaves in the regiments in South Carolina because they were having a man problem shortage, and he thought this was the way it could be done. He'd seen black soldiers behave well on the northern battlefields. He thought South Carolina could solve its manpower problem that way. And again, the blacks would be promised freedom at the end of their term of service, provided they gave good service. This was not popular in South Carolina. And although the measure went before the legislature, it was voted down. Blacks were still serving as servants, although not officially enlisted in the Continental ranks. They were still serving there during the war, but they did not have the status of soldiers. Somewhat like women serving in World War I. We were out there, ladies were out there in the danger and the shot and shell falling, but they weren't soldiers and they weren't entitled to veterans benefits. Buddy would have been at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. If a cannonball had landed on top of him, it would not have distinguished him from an enlisted soldier of the 2nd Regiment. He was undoubtedly at Savannah, and he was undoubtedly at Utah Springs. And once again, bullets are not very and cannon especially, don't care who you are. They'll kill you anyway. So they don't care whether you are a musician, and we know there were blacks serving as musicians in the Army. They don't care whether, well, they didn't have medics, but they didn't care whether you were a combatant or non-combatant. If you were in the way of a bullet or a piece of chain shot, you were dead. And from all we know, Buddy served bravely. He did his duty. All right. So now we come, and by the way, some say, well, he had to go because he was a slave. Let me tell you, World War I and World War II and the Korean War and Vietnam were fought with guys who didn't want to go. They were drafted. And the most decorated soldier in World War I was Alvin York, and he was drafted. So whether you're drafted or you volunteer really doesn't relate to how well you behave on the battlefield. A lot of people who were drafted behaved very well. So okay, we come to 1780, the British invade South Carolina. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Marion, commanding the 2nd Regiment, he's there at the siege when it begins, but on March 19th, he breaks his ankle and is a very bad break. Lincoln is convinced the city will fall to the British, and all officers without command or unfit for duty are ordered from the city. And on April 13th, Marion leaves Charlestown on a ferry, one of the last ferries out of the city, across the Cooper River. And as they're leaving, just as they're leaving, the big siege guns from the British open up and rain down fire and death on the city. And we can only imagine what Marion must have been thinking when that happened. He could not walk, he could not stand, he could not ride a horse. He left the city on a stretcher. And Buddy left with him and cared for him. They went out through Monk's Corner, and only hours after they went through Monk's Corner, the American detachment that was there to defend Monk's Corner and keep the road open to Charlestown was attacked by Colonel Tarleton and totally disrupted and destroyed. That sealed the fate of the city. The British now began a mopping up campaign. They ran down all the small American units around, and Marion, as one of the highest ranking Continental officers left still large in the country, must have been, as they would say, a person of interest. The British wanted him and any other senior officer. William Longstreet, in his memoirs later, said that Marion was so lame he was obliged to skulk about from house to house among his friends, and sometimes to hide in the bushes. Now, Marion couldn't go to his relations because his brother Job had married into a Tory family in the Gilliards, and they would have happily tracked, in fact, tried to track Marion down to turn him over to the British to ingratiate themselves to the British. So Marion was in tough shape. And the person who cared for him and kept him out of the hands of the British was Buddy. Buddy was there constantly, physically having to carry him at times, but certainly caring for him the entire time. Had Buddy said to Marion, "Bye, I'm leaving," Marion could have done nothing about it. In fact, the British were saying to the blacks who were owned by American patriots, if you desert your patriot owners and come to Charlestown, we will give you your freedom. And Buddy could have taken them up on that. He didn't. Had he brought Marion with him, he undoubtedly would have been given a reward. He didn't do that. So between April and August, they were hiding out. And in August, a call came from a new American Army that they wanted all American officers at large in South Carolina to join the new American Army, and Buddy and Marion set out for North Carolina. It was a 274-mile journey through enemy territory. They traveled alone because Marion had been trained in the rules of escape and evasion by no less a group than Rogers Rangers. He would have traveled in as small a group as possible to avoid attention. When they finally got to the American Army up north in North Carolina, Arthur Williams, somebody's read that before, I'll read it again, commented that Marion had been with the Army a few days, attended by a very few followers, distinguished by small black leather caps. Interestingly enough, Buddy was wearing the small black leather cap of the 1st and 2nd Continental Regiments of the American Army, which indicates to me that he had been used to wearing some sort of a military uniform during the time he was serving Marion, and Marion was in the military. Their number did not exceed 20 men and boys, some white, some black. and all mounted, but most of them miserably equipped. Of all the people in South Carolina, only 20 people made that trip to North Carolina to rejoin the American Army. Everybody else was flocking into Charlestown to say, "We love you, King of England, and we'll be good loyalists." But 20 men went north. But he was also one of the 10 men who then went south with Marion to begin the partisan operations in South Carolina. When Marion took over the Williamsburg militia, he still could not mount or dismount a horse without help, but he had to be there to help him. As the partisan goes, still on back here. As partisan operations began in South Carolina, and Marion became more of a pain to Cornwallis, Cornwallis was heard to say he would give a lot to have Marion taken. Not only could Buddy have been free if he turned Marion in, and he certainly had the information and ability to do that, he would have been very well rewarded at this time by doing that. By all accounts, Marion and Buddy stayed together. Buddy shared all the dangers, all the difficulties, all the hardships of war as a partisan with Francis Marion. They went everywhere together. And after the war, when Marion got married in 1786, he married Mary Esther, and they say that Mary Esther, Buddy, and Francis Marion would go hunting and fishing together. They go on trips to the mountains in the summer to enjoy the woods. As I said before, Buddy outlived Francis Marion, he outlived Mary Esther, and we don't know exactly when he died, but he apparently had an honored life after the war. But he was well thought of by Marion's contemporaries. Frequently he's mentioned in their accounts. His adventures around with Marion after the fall of Charlestown today in the American Army probably would have been worth a medal. And at that time, very few medals were given out, very few honors were given out to soldiers. But you know, and here I'm going to depart from the historian, and I'm going to go in for a minute be the novelist. If I could have imposed 21st century standards on an 18th century army, I think maybe the citation should have read as follows. Attention to orders. That Oscar Marion, a civilian rendering services to the Continental Army, at great risk to himself and in disregard of his personal interests, did for 109 days, starting on April 13, 1780, while in enemy-occupied territory, aided an injured Continental officer, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Marion, and did aid said officer to avoid capture, and did care for said officer until he could sufficiently be recovered to travel, and did thereafter help said officer, who could not travel without assistance, in avoiding enemy patrols. They were searching for said officer to travel 274 miles through enemy territory under hazardous conditions to reach American lines and return to the American Army. Such conduct reflects the highest honor upon said Oscar Marion. After the war, Marion refused to sit for a portrait, but he had a neighbor, John Blake White, a little kid who wanted to be an artist. And they say Marion posed for White as a kid. But White grew up to be a very good artist, and one of the paintings he did became very famous, called Sweet Potato Painting. And people who saw it, who were alive, while Marion was alive, who knew Marion when he was alive, said it was a good picture of Marion. And we are told also that not only was it a portrait of Marion, but it was a portrait of Buddy. Now, a lot of people point to this guy here and say, "Oh, that's Buddy." That's not Buddy. That means a field hand. That's Buddy. He's dressed as a gentleman. He's the gentleman's gentleman. He's not a field hand. And you notice he's behind Marion's right hand. He's supporting he's his right-hand man. And you'll also notice Buddy's left arm comes around and encircles Marion, as if he's caring for him. And so I like to say that Buddy is the hero in the shadows, taking care of Marion in art as he had in life. And that's the story of Buddy. Thank you. By the way, that's probably the best picture of Buddy, and that's probably the best picture of Francis Marion. All the others are kind of funny, including the ones I've done. Any questions? Yes, Charles.
We back up 2 slides since you're doing art analysis. Answer a couple questions for me.
Sure.
I would like you to comment on the guy on the far right side and the guy in the
This guy
turban. Yeah, the guy in the turban behind the pile of sweet potatoes. Those are 2.
Well, this guy is definitely the Tower Indian. That's what I know. This guy here is weird.
Charles Baxley.
Oh, that's Charles Baxley? Right here. Charles, I didn't know you were in the picture. Thank you for letting me know.
I put that on a pink shirt.
But you know what? This also kind of shows the variety of people who are serving the Marion. You have this fellow here, whoever. You've got the Indian, you've got blacks, and you've got a couple of farmer-type looking people. And so there's quite a variety of people that serve with Marion. And I think that White was trying to capture that in this picture.
Who's the British officer?
The British officer is probably lieutenant or not ensign, but they call him Cornet Money, I think his name was, that came to Merritt. Thank you, Merritt. He came to treat Marion. But we don't know for sure. That's just a guess. Yes.
There's an uncanny resemblance between Marion and Oscar.
Well, that's me. That's.
What?
You mean there?
It's more than uncanny.
Oscar was probably part Indian, you know, and I can't comment beyond that. You know, they're artists and they're artists. There are artists like me that aren't very good, and there are artists that are better. But yes.
There's a print by Robert Wilson that's also called Sweet Potato Dinner, but in that one, Oscar doesn't appear. I didn't know if you know any background on Robert Wilson's print of Sweet Potato Dinner.
There's been a whole bunch of copies of the sweet potato picture. Blake White did at least 5, and the reason White's big painting is significant is at the age of when Marion died, White was 14 years old, and White was a neighbor of Marion, so he would have known him. White has pictures of Marion at the Battle of Fort Moultrie and also at the Battle of the siege of Fort Mont. And these are the best likenesses we can actually have of Francis Marion. Most of the likenesses we have of Francis Marion are totally bogus. They were just, find a nice French face, and that was it. Anybody else? Thank you very much.